Hello, everyone, and welcome to CogNosco and Ascolto, the official scientific podcast of CogNosco Lab. This podcast series highlights our research in cognitive science and artificial intelligence.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at how our brains store and process words.
Yes. We're going to be delving into the mental lexicon, but not in just a look up a definition kind of way.
Right. It's not like you're, memorizing vocabulary lists or anything. This is about how words connect and interact like a web in our minds.
Exactly.
Okay.
The paper we're looking at today is called Cognitive Modeling of Concepts in the Mental Lexicon with Multilayer Networks, Insights, Advancements, and Future Challenges. It was published in Psychonomic Bulletin Review in March 2024.
Okay, so multilayer networks. This is what makes this paper special.
Yeah. So for a long time, researchers have used simpler models like single-layer networks to try and represent the mental lexicon.
Okay.
And these were useful, but they could only really capture one type of relationship between words at a time.
So, like, they might show words that are linked by meaning or by sound, but not both at the same time?
Exactly. You can kind of think of it like a city map that only shows the streets, but there's no information on bus routes or subway lines. It gives you a limited view of how to actually get around.
I see. Okay, so that's where these multilayer networks come in. They're like a much more comprehensive map.
Exactly. They allow us to see how words are connected on multiple levels all at once. So by meaning, by sound, grammar, even how often we use them, it's kind of like having a city map with streets, bus routes, subway lines, and even pedestrian walkways all layered on top of each other.
Wow, that's a much richer way to visualize those connections between words. But how do they actually work? How do researchers build these multi-layer networks?
Well, they can use all sorts of data. They might analyze large text corpora to see how often words appear together, or, they might run experiments where people have to make judgments about word relationships.
So like asking people to list words that are similar in meaning, or that rhyme, or that often appear in the same sentence.
Yeah, exactly. And by combining these different types of data, researchers can create these incredibly intricate networks that show us this kind of hidden structure of the mental lexicon.
Okay. It sounds super complex.
Yeah.
But what kind of insights have we gained from them? What makes them so exciting to researchers?
Well, one of the most fascinating discoveries is the emergence of something called the largest viable component, or LVC for short.
The LVC, okay. What is that?
You can think of it like the core of the mental lexicon. It's this cluster of words that are highly viable. That means that they're connected on all layers of the network simultaneously.
So they have strong links based on meaning, sound, grammar, and frequency of use.
Exactly. They're like the super connected words in our vocabulary.
So these are the words that are easily accessed and used in all sorts of different contexts.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that the LVC isn't just, a random assortment of words. It's primarily composed of very frequently used concrete words.
The kinds of words that we learn early in life, right? So like dog, cat, house, run, that sort of thing.
Precisely. The basic building blocks of language. And here's where it gets really fascinating. Researchers think that the LVC plays a crucial role in language development.
Okay, so how's it connected to how we learn language?
Well, studies have shown that the LVC actually emerges in a very specific way during childhood. It doesn't just, exist from birth. It develops over time.
Our brains are gradually building this core cluster of interconnected words.
Exactly. And there's evidence that the emergence of the LVC actually coincides with a major leap in cognitive development in children.
So, once this interconnected web of words reaches a certain point, it allows their brains to learn and use language more effectively.
That's the idea. You can think about it kind of like building a strong foundation for a house. Once you have that solid base, you can start adding all sorts of more complex structures on top.
I see. That makes sense. So the LVC is sort of like the linguistic scaffolding that helps kids develop more advanced language skills.
Mm-hmm.
But how do researchers actually observe that, the development of the LVC?
Well, they might present children with various word tasks, like asking them to name pictures or to generate lists of words that fit certain categories.
So they're looking at how easily the children can retrieve and manipulate words.
Yeah, exactly. And by analyzing the patterns in their responses, they can start to see this LVC taking shape in the children's mental lexicons.
Wow, fascinating. But I'm curious about the future challenges part that was in the title of this paper. What are some of the big unanswered questions about the mental lexicon and these multi-layer networks?
Well, one of the biggest questions is how exactly these networks actually change and adapt throughout our lives. We know that they develop during childhood, but what happens, as we learn new words, new concepts, or even as we experience cognitive decline later in life?
Right, because it's not like our mental lexicons just become static once we reach adulthood. They must be constantly evolving.
Exactly. And understanding how those changes occur is a major area of ongoing research. And then another challenge is trying to figure out how these networks might differ across individuals. We all have unique experiences, knowledge bases, so it stands to reason that our mental lexicons might be structured a little bit differently.
So like someone who's a musician might have a very different LVC or network structure than someone who's a chef.
It's a possibility. And exploring those individual differences could help us understand, why some people are better at certain language tasks than others, or why some people are more creative with language.
This is incredible. It really feels like we're finally starting to peek behind the curtain and see how our brains are organizing and processing language.
Exactly. And it's not even just about language itself. This research has implications for understanding other cognitive processes, like memory, learning, and even creativity.
Okay, so before we go any further, I just want to make sure I'm grasping the key concepts here. So we've got these multi-layer networks that are letting us visualize the connections between words in our minds. And within these networks, we've discovered this core cluster of highly connected words called the LVC, which seems to be playing a really important role in language development.
That's a great summary. And there's still so much more to uncover about the mental lexicon in these networks. We've only just begun to scratch the surface.
Well, I'm excited to dive deeper.
So picking up where we left off, these multi-layer networks, they don't just, reveal the core of the mental lexicon with the LVC.
Right.
They also allow us to explore how words kind of cluster into more specialized groups,
Okay.
a bit like neighborhoods in a city.
Okay. Yeah, I remember you mentioning community detection earlier. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. So think of it this way. Within a city, you have all these different areas that kind of specialize in certain things. You might have like a financial district, a theater district, a shopping district.
Right.
And each of these districts has its own unique kind of set of landmarks and businesses and activities.
Yeah, and you wouldn't find a high-end boutique in the middle of an industrial area.
Exactly. And just like in a city, these, communities of words in the mental lexicon, they reflect these different areas of knowledge or experience.
Okay.
So we might have a community of words related to cooking, another one for words related to music, another one for sports, and so on.
So it's not just that these words are connected by meaning, but they're also grouped together based on these shared themes or contexts.
Precisely. And what's really cool is that these communities can overlap and interact in really interesting ways.
Okay.
So remember how we were talking about words being connected on multiple layers? Well, a word might actually belong to different communities depending on which layer we're looking at.
Okay, can you give me an example? How could a single word belong to multiple communities?
Sure. So let's take the word star.
Okay.
So on a layer that's related to astronomy, star would likely be clustered with words like galaxy, planet, telescope, all these things related to celestial objects.
Yeah, makes sense. Those are all words we'd use when we're talking about space.
Right. But then on a layer that's related to, say, visual appearance star, might cluster with words like bright, shining, glowing, describing qualities of light.
Ah, I see. So the word star has different neighbors depending on whether we're thinking about space or visual properties.
Exactly. And this ability to flexibly activate different communities, depending on the context, is a crucial aspect of language processing. It's like having this mental map with multiple layers that we can switch between effortlessly.
So if I'm reading an article about astronomy, my brain is automatically activating the star community that's related to space. But if I'm listening to a song about a shining star, my brain jumps over to this completely different community of words.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It really highlights this dynamic and context-sensitive nature of our mental lexicon.
Right.
It's not just a static dictionary. It's constantly adapting to the situation and our current thoughts.
Wow, this is mind-blowing. But how do researchers actually detect these communities? Like, do they just eyeball these networks and draw circles around groups of words?
It's a little more sophisticated than that. They actually use algorithms that analyze the network structure and identify clusters of words that are highly interconnected within specific layers. It's kind of like using a special filter to highlight certain patterns in a complex tapestry.
So the algorithm is looking for groups of words that are really tightly knit together based on their connections.
Exactly. And these algorithms can reveal communities that we might not even notice just by looking at the network ourselves. They can kind of uncover these hidden relationships between words and concepts.
This is fascinating, but I'm also starting to get why these multi-layered networks are so challenging to study. It's like trying to map a landscape that's constantly changing.
That's a great analogy. The mental lexicon is incredibly complex and dynamic. And it's not just about the words themselves, but about the myriad ways that those words are connected and organized in our minds.
Okay, so speaking of complexity, you mentioned earlier that these multi-layer networks can also reveal these hidden interactions between different layers. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so remember how we were talking about those bridges and tunnels in our 3D map analogy? Well, multi-layer networks can actually help us to see how things that are happening on one layer might influence things that are happening on another layer, even if those layers aren't directly connected.
Okay.
Like events on one layer might be influencing events on another.
Can you give me a concrete example? Like, what do you mean by the hidden interaction between layers?
Sure. So imagine you're trying to remember the name of a particular fruit.
Right.
And you know it's red, and you know it grows on a tree,
Uh-huh.
but the name is just on the tip of your tongue.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Right.
It's like the word is right there, but I just can't grab it.
Exactly. So you have information about the fruit's color, and you have information about its growing location. Those are two separate layers of information, right?
Okay, so the color layer might be connected to words like red, crimson, scarlet. And then the location layer might be connected to tree, branch, orchard.
Precisely. Now imagine there's this third layer, a hidden layer related to the fruit's taste. Let's say this fruit is tart.
Yeah.
That tartness might be indirectly linked to the name apple through a network of associations.
So even though the word tart and the word apple aren't directly connected in my mind, the tartness might be influencing my ability to retrieve the word apple.
Exactly. It's like the tartness is this hidden bridge between those two seemingly unrelated concepts.
Interesting.
And this is just one example. There could be countless other ways that different layers interact and influence each other behind the scenes.
So how do researchers study these hidden interactions? It seems like it would be incredibly difficult to tease apart all of these layers and all of these connections.
It is a challenge, but there are statistical techniques that allow researchers to analyze the network structure and look for patterns that kind of suggest these hidden interactions. For example, they might see that the presence of a connection on one layer significantly increases the likelihood of a connection forming on another layer, even if those layers aren't directly linked.
So it's like a statistical clue that something else is going on behind the scenes, some unseen factor that's influencing the relationship between those two layers.
Precisely. And this is where the concepts of mediation and suppression come into play.
Okay, those are two words that I remember you mentioning earlier, but I'm not sure I totally understood what they meant.
Right. So in the context of these multi-layer networks, mediation refers to the idea that a connection between two layers might be explained by a third mediating layer. Like in our fruit example,
Okay.
the tartness might be mediating the connection between the color red and the name apple.
So the mediating layer is like the missing link that explains the relationship between the other two.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like a bridge that connects two islands that wouldn't otherwise be accessible to each other.
I like that.
And then on the other hand, suppression refers to the idea that a connection on one layer might actually inhibit or suppress a connection on another layer.
Okay, that's interesting. Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So imagine you're trying to learn a new word in a foreign language.
Okay.
And let's say this word is visually similar to a word in your native language, but it has a completely different meaning.
Oh, yeah, I've experienced that. It's so confusing when words look alike but mean different things.
Exactly. So in this scenario, that visual similarity between the words might initially create a strong connection on the visual layer of your mental lexicon.
Okay, so my brain is seeing those two words as visually similar and trying to group them together.
Precisely. But because the meanings are so different, the semantic layer of your lexicon might actually suppress that connection.
So my brain is like, hold on, these words might look alike, but their meanings are totally different, so we need to keep them separate.
Exactly. The semantic layer is essentially overriding the visual layer in this case.
This is incredibly complex, but it's also amazing to think about all these intricate processes that are happening in our brains every time we use language.
It really is remarkable. And as we kind of delve deeper into these multi-layer networks, we're only just beginning to appreciate the full extent of that complexity.
Well, I'm definitely ready to delve deeper. Okay, so we've been talking about all of these fascinating multi-layered networks and how they're giving us this whole new perspective on the mental lexicon.
Yeah, they're providing these incredible insights into the organization and processing of words in our minds.
As we've been discussing these networks and how complex they are, I can't help but think about this other type of network that's been getting a lot of attention lately. Artificial neural networks.
Ah, yeah, the famous ANNs. They're all over the news these days, right?
Yeah.
Powering everything from self-driving cars to those language translation apps.
Exactly. And they're made up of layers and connections too, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, are these artificial neural networks similar at all to the cognitive multi-layer networks that we've been talking about? Or are they totally different things?
That's a great question. And yeah, it's easy to get them confused because they both use the word network. But while there are some, superficial similarities, there's a fundamental difference in their purpose and in their structure.
I'm all ears. What's the key distinction between these two types of networks?
The main difference is in what the nodes in each network represent. So in an artificial neural network, the nodes are like these tiny processing units that receive input, perform a calculation, and then send output to other nodes.
So they're kind of like miniature calculators all linked together.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And by adjusting the strength of the connections between these nodes, the network can learn to perform specific tasks like recognizing patterns or making predictions.
So the focus with those ANNs is on processing information and learning from data.
Exactly. They're designed to try and mimic certain aspects of how the brain processes information, but they don't necessarily reflect the actual structure of knowledge in our minds.
Okay, so that's where these cognitive multi-layer networks come in. They're more about representing the content of our thoughts rather than the actual process of thinking.
Precisely. In a cognitive multilayer network, the nodes aren't processing units. They're the actual pieces of information themselves. Words, concepts, ideas.
So the nodes are like the building blocks of knowledge,
Yeah.
and the links between them show us how those blocks are related.
Exactly. It's like the difference between a recipe and the act of cooking. The recipe tells you the ingredients and how they're combined, while the act of cooking involves actually using those ingredients to create a dish.
So artificial neural networks are like the cooking process, while cognitive networks are like the recipe itself.
That's a great analogy. Both are important, but they serve different purposes. ANNs are incredibly powerful tools for things like pattern recognition, machine learning, and AI, but they don't necessarily give us a clear picture of how knowledge is structured in the human mind. That's where cognitive networks come in.
Okay, yeah, that distinction is making a lot more sense to me now. It's like the difference between studying the electrical circuits in a computer and analyzing the code that actually runs the programs.
Precisely. Both are essential for understanding how the system works, but they're looking at different aspects.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. We've learned that the mental lexicon is so much more than just a dictionary. It's this dynamic, interconnected web of words and sounds and meanings. And we've seen how these multi-layered networks are helping us to uncover all of these fascinating insights about how our brains organize language, and even how that relates to things like language development, cognitive challenges, and potentially even creativity.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. This research opens up so many possibilities for understanding not just language, but other complex cognitive systems as well. As we continue to develop and refine these multi-layer network models, who knows what other secrets of the human mind we might unlock.
I, for one, am incredibly excited to see where this research leads. It's like we're finally getting a glimpse behind the curtain of our own minds. And to our listeners, if you've ever wondered about the amazing complexity of language and how your brain makes sense of it all, I hope this deep dive has given you a newfound appreciation for the intricate workings of your mental lexicon. And who knows, maybe you'll even start seeing multi-layer networks everywhere you look.